Missouri School of Journalism. Welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. James Ball has had an unusual career in journalism. Today, Ball is a special projects editor for The Guardian, the American affiliate of the London-based newspaper and website. But years ago, when he was a journalist for the Bureau for Investigative Journalism in the UK, Ball met Wikileaks founder Julian Assange. Ball was covering the whistleblower group's release of the Iraq war logs, a trove of nearly 400,000 classified U.S. military documents. In 2010, Assange recruited Ball to Wikileaks to become its in-house journalist, as it was preparing to release thousands of classified U.S. State Department cables. Revelations from those cables included news that U.S. diplomats had been ordered to obtain the credit card and frequent flyer numbers of Chinese, French, and other diplomats at the United Nations, that Arab nations had been urging the U.S. to launch a first strike on Iran, and that the Chinese government was deeply involved in online spying and cyber attacks. Ball eventually had a falling out with Assange and left Wikileaks to go to work for The Guardian. While there, he's been involved in that newspaper's coverage of surveillance by the National Security Agency, reporting based on documents from whistleblower Edward Snowden. The Guardian is now one of the most popular news sites in the world, and it's a recipient of a 2014 Missouri Honor Medal from the Missouri School of Journalism. James Ball, welcome to Global Journalist. I wanted to ask you first if you could please just describe your interactions with Julian Assange and how you came to be working inside WikiLeaks.
So I worked at quite a small not-for-profit journalism outfit in the UK, and one of the people on our advisory board also ran conferences, and he had run into Assange a few times and knew what was coming up and was quite keen to sort of see if he could get our newsroom in to help out. And so he sort of brokered us to have dinner on a Saturday night, right in the middle of my holiday actually, with Assange, and sort of talk through why we could maybe sort of help him make some television for the next ones to up the impact versus the Afghan logs. So we meet in this Turkish restaurant.
The Afghan logs, there was a separate disclosure of U.S. military documents about the Afghan war.
That's the ones, yeah. And so a day or two after that, we have lunch and dinner in this Turkish restaurant, and sort of keep talking about what we could do, how we could analyse them, what documentaries we thought we could make. And we sort of thought this would be a bit of an icebreaker. You know, I'd come halfway across the country to get there, and so was shattered, had kind of all my stuff in a bag. And Assange kind of says, oh, hey, I can tell you a bit more about it if you sort of come with me. And so we walked down the road and into this little sort of nondescript mews flat he was staying in at the time. And he sort of keeps chatting, goes, yeah, okay, I'll give you a while to work on it. Let's see if you can deliver the TV commissions you said you could, but sure. And everyone's sort of looking around. There are two or three of us still there, my two bosses and me, and he kind of goes, has someone got a USB stick? And thankfully I'd had the presence
like
of mind.
Like a thumb drive,
just
this
a
big.
Little thumb drive. And I'd had the presence of mind to bring one, and I kind of hand it over. And 20 minutes later, it's got 390,000 classified military documents on it. It's about 1 o'clock in the morning. It's kind of just the two of us in there, and he sort of tells me to go off. Don't go straight home, he says. He didn't want his address linked with there. So I kind of had to find somewhere to be at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday morning with military records in my pocket. Not the world's most comfortable experience. Sort of turned up, went back to my house sort of 7 a.m. the next morning, and kind of got my laptops, went straight into the office and started work.
Now, the Iraq war logs made a splash when they were reported on at the time. They gave a lot of information about U.S. soldiers, what they saw, what they did inside Iraq. Talk to us about WikiLeaks' next project and how you became involved in the State Department leaks.
Essentially, you know, as we worked on the Afghan documents, which were, I mean, a really shocking corpus of information, you know, it didn't show malice necessarily, but it showed just the real kind of horrifying and before then hidden toll of that war kind of on the country, the civil war it created, and also, frankly, on a lot of the US troops there too. But we knew there was this kind of model load of cables and that WikiLeaks had it, and I'd been talking to Assange a lot, sort of in the evenings, online, you know, little encrypted chats, and he kind of said, you know, if you want to work on the next set, you're going to have to work for me. And I went to see my old sort of journalism school professor who said, no, you can't do that. Your career's going quite well now. You'll never work in mainstream journalism again if you do this. You know, I was getting good advice from good people, sort of saying, don't do it. But I knew how significant and how big that story was. And I kind of thought, I think I could contribute to this. And also, I just want to see what happens. And so I decided to go for it. And so I went to work for WikiLeaks. And it's a kind of live-work arrangement, or it certainly was there. You know, you were out in this manor house in the middle of Norfolk, sort of working 16 hours a day, sort of the odd meal in amongst. You don't see your friends, you don't see your family. You're just doing this. But it was a heck of a time.
Eventually, you had a falling out with Assange. Talk to us about what happened. Why did you leave WikiLeaks? What led up to that?
There's always sort of these bits of disillusionment. You know, I don't think it would be a massive news revelation to say Assange is a difficult character. But you know that when you go in. The difficulty kind of comes from, you know, the specific instant for me was there was a guy who was sort of introduced to us as a friend of Julian's who would be doing a lot of the kind of Russian and Eastern Europe reporting. And I was asked and agreed to give him 100,000 cables relating to that region and to Israel. And we sort of later learned his name, and he was kind of a relatively unpleasant Holocaust-denying sort of far-left writer with quite a lot of Kremlin ties. And we got reports sort of in the following weeks he was trying to sell them to pro-Russian government newspapers and this kind of stuff. And we weren't meant to be selling this stuff. We were meant to be sort of working on it. And then fairly good reports from a couple of human rights groups that he tried to sell it to the dictator of Belarus. And all Assange did and all WikiLeaks did was deny that he even had any cables. It's like, I knew that wasn't true, because not knowing who he was or what he would do, I'd given them to him. And this kind of cover-up and this lying to sort of cover your own back and all of this just seemed to go against everything they said they believed in. And it was a bit of a final straw, you know?
So WikiLeaks passed the cables to the writer Israel Shamir.
Yep.
He took them to the Belarusians, among others. WikiLeaks later, Julian Assange at least later, denied that WikiLeaks had ever passed them.
Yep. And I knew they had because I had been the person to do it. Before we knew who it was, you know, he was introduced to us as a journalist. There are a lot of journalists who were there who are really good journalists who I have a lot of time for. He was just not one of them. And it was so far beyond what's acceptable. You just kind of thought, the only way back from that kind of thing is to admit we made a horrible mistake here. We're going to look into what happened. We're going to fix this, and we're going to condemn it. And they just wouldn't do that. And so I just kind of thought, you know, I like the principle of what you're trying to do. I'm proud of a lot of the work I've done, but I just can't support this organisation and this attitude. And so, yeah, I left. It wasn't the most amicable of separations.
Let me ask you about PFC Chelsea Manning, formerly Bradley Manning, who's serving a 35-year prison sentence now in a U.S. military prison, was the original source of these documents for the Afghan war logs, the Iraq war logs, the State Department cables. How did you feel that WikiLeaks treated Private Manning? Did WikiLeaks do enough to help Private Manning?
I kind of wonder about this. I think we have to sort of look, and when we look at what's happened to Manning, there's no doubt the place that kind of has treated her the worst is the US judicial system. You know, the admitted sort of completely inappropriate, bordering on barbaric pre-trial treatment was just so far from acceptable, and that had so little impact on the sentencing and on the trial, I think was fairly shameful. This is
when Manning was kept in solitary confinement and...
Yeah, and sort of deprived of sleep and deprived of clothes, and it's kind of all sorts of pretty nasty, sort of low-level bullying treatment by kind of the world's biggest superpower and what is meant to be the embodiment of, you know, decent values, you know, sort of the envy of the world. I think it's a pity to hand that kind of thing to countries with much worse human rights records. But it did make me wonder, you know, what does this we never know who our sources are so we can never do anything with them, that kind of attitude which WikiLeaks had then, who does that protect? Does it protect the sort of the news organisation or the whistleblowing organisation or the whistleblower? I mean, Manning was caught because she needed someone to talk to, and the person she chose to reach out and talk to was a terrible decision. It was a guy called Adrian Lamo who promptly turned her in. And so, if she had have been dealing with a more conventional reporter who might have had the sort of time and not built that distance between them, might she have done better? Who knows? It's very hard to say.
You're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. Today on Global Journalist, we're talking to James Ball, the special projects editor for The Guardian. Ball was formerly Wikileaks in-house journalist when that group leaked hundreds of thousands of classified U.S. State Department cables, and has also covered whistleblower Edward Snowden's revelations about surveillance by the National Security Agency. For more Global Journalist content, visit us online at globaljournalist.org. There you can listen to or watch episodes from our archive and read in-depth articles on international affairs and free press issues. We're also on social media. You can like us on Facebook, join our LinkedIn group, or follow us on Twitter at GlobalJourn. James Ball, I want to ask you as well, given that Manning is in a cell in military custody and won't be released until the 2040s, basically, if you were her looking at what had occurred and looking at the impacts of the WikiLeaks disclosures, would you feel like it had all been worth it? In other words, in terms of what came out of those disclosures, does it justify what had happened?
I'd quickly say first, there's hopefully reasons to hope Manning could be out sooner. She's got an appeal coming up, and with various bits of parole and such like, she could be out at the end of this decade, which I think is still far too long, but is better. I think it's interesting seeing all the different motivations people put onto Manning, because she's had not much opportunity to speak on these things for herself. People have kind of laid at the idea that she was a pacifist or all sorts of other issues, and she's actually spoken out against that. She's not a kind of, the US should never involve in military, the US should never do these things. But she believed what she was seeing in her work were abuses and that they should be brought to light. And she was fully aware of what the consequences should be. You can see that from what she was writing at the time. And so it's very hard to know if she will feel it was worth it or not. I feel like she did what she did and what people did based on the material she disclosed really shed a light on two conflicts that we otherwise just didn't know that level of information about, and on global diplomacy, and actually on Guantanamo Bay as well, the kind of leak everyone forgets, in quite a substantive way. There's also, was it her actions and how, did they show that actually media outlets, if they got this information, would publish it, people would look at it, people would do it, maybe, and who knows, maybe that was one of the things that spurred, say, Snowden on, or lots of other whistleblowers who've done really substantial stuff, but not of that same global scale. We went 40 years between the Pentagon Papers and the Manning releases. We went 4 years between that and Snowden. So, maybe we're seeing the start of, the keeping government secrets, and sort of this history of dark rooms is getting a lot more difficult now.
I want to ask you about the Edward Snowden leaks as well, because I understand that you worked with Glenn Greenwald and some of the other journalists at The Guardian on the reporting that came out of those documents. What tools did you use to analyze those? What was your role in this?
It was such a small core team of us doing this for such a long time that we all did a bit of everything. But one of my jobs was trying to sort of help on the technical side of understanding the stories, and also the technical side of reporting them. And so we were restricted in a lot of ways in that we had to keep this material as secure as we possibly could, physical security, encryption, all this kind of stuff. So it's not like we could just browse through it on a regular computer connected to the internet, which would have made reporting a lot easier. But, we used tools that are kind of used often by lawyers on big cases, or by private detectives that can pull together lots of different kinds of information and search on lots of terms to really help us try and make the connections and join it up and keep related documents together.
So these are secure document sharing systems then?
Not sharing, just storing on one sort of encrypted drive in one place. Nothing was shared on networks ever. We had sort of very strict sort of security rules throughout. We know we're not going to be able to keep information like the NSA, although the NSA couldn't keep this information. But we wanted to do everything we could to be responsible. I mean, you know, it kind of was important to us that our journalism was right, but also that we were doing what we could with what we had to try and make sure we were treating this stuff appropriately. And I mean, one of the interesting things of that is we also sort of said both to the NSA and to GCHQ, which is UK equivalent, if you want to give us any additional tips on stuff we should do to make you guys more comfortable, because we're going to keep reporting on it, feel free to give us advice on protecting this stuff. And none of them would. And so when you sort of hear these people come out and say, this is national security, this is this, you kind of think, well, do you mean that? Because they really didn't contribute. And you sort of think we did try to play as reasonably as we could in terms of keeping the material safe, in terms of working on it, in terms of trying to have constructive conversations, but it was surprisingly difficult.
I want to ask you what advice you might have for the next whistleblower. Say that I'm someone inside the National Security Agency now that has another trove of documents. If I look at what's happened to Private Manning, who's in jail for decades, if I look at Julian Assange inside the embassy in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, under basically seeking asylum, and if I look at Edward Snowden in exile in Russia, I say, geez, these people don't live very happy lives. How can I leak documents in a way that's safe and secure?
It's often going to be a sacrifice. I mean, it's a pretty selfless act to do something like this, and so you really have to believe in what you're doing. And I think that's the right thing. You don't want people doing this stuff just because they dislike their boss. I think you've got to see something in there that drives you as in the public interest. After that, it's a different set of steps. Manning was caught and jailed. Snowden, okay, I doubt. I mean, we know he would like to be in the US, and I think we know, given what happened when you look at Manning, why he doesn't trust the justice system. But he's living out there with his girlfriend. It's long-term girlfriend. It doesn't sound like he has the most awful life, but it's obviously not the life he had before, and it's probably a fair bit less fun. Assange is in the embassy through his own making. I mean, he's not in there through any justice system pursuing him for his work. It's for a private matter relating to Sweden, and I just don't buy the conspiracy theories. But on the whistleblowing point, I think we've never had a source who's known more about security and privacy and how to cover his tracks than Snowden. And Edward Snowden decided the best protection he could do for himself was revealing himself. He didn't think he could keep himself secret. And I think we should try and take some message from that. If you're trying to get these particular agencies and you worked inside them, they may well find you, and you should be aware it's never going to be 100% safe. But newsrooms and sources are getting a lot more sophisticated. We've got tools like Secure Drop, which are for anonymous whistleblowing. We've got PGP emails. We use burner addresses. There's a lot you can do to educate yourself, and I think there's a lot more we can do as journalists and news organisations to help increase that public awareness. But it's always going to be a pretty selfless thing to do, I think.
You're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. Today on Global Journalist, we're talking to James Ball, the special projects editor for The Guardian. Ball was formerly WikiLeaks in-house journalist when that group leaked hundreds of thousands of classified U.S. State Department cables. He's also covered whistleblower Edward Snowden's revelations about surveillance by the National Security Agency. For more Global Journalist content, visit us online at globaljournalist.org. There you can listen to or watch episodes from our archive and read in-depth articles on international affairs and free press issues. We're also on social media. You can like us on Facebook, join our LinkedIn group, or follow us on Twitter @GlobalJourn. I want to turn the conversation now to The Guardian itself. I was wondering if you could tell me about The Guardian's ownership structure. It's owned by a foundation called the Scott Trust. How does that affect the culture inside the newsroom and the types of stories that you can pursue?
It's pretty great, in all honesty. Being owned by a trust essentially means we don't have a proprietor. So we don't have to worry about his politics or his other business interests or kind of not upsetting him. With us, the editorial comes first. The mission of the Scott Trust is to continue The Guardian's journalism. And so thanks to sort of other businesses it used to own and has now sold, we've got a decent investment fund behind us to try and help us transition to sort of doing journalism in a way that will be sustainable and fund itself without necessarily, in 10 years' time, a print paper. But it also means we work for an organisation where we have a trust to back up our editor. We have a very good and actually quite successful commercial operation at The Guardian. We make a loss, but we try not to, and our losses are shrinking. But if it ever came down, commercial interest will really never trump editorial. No one at The Guardian would ever dream of saying, hey, this is an advertiser, can you back off them a bit, or don't say this about this country, we're trying to do a deal with them. If it ever came down, I think every journalist in the building knows, if it ever came down to a fight between our editor and our CEO, and it wouldn't, our CEO is as much on the mission as anyone else, but you can guarantee it would be the editor that won, and that is a very empowering thing for you as a journalist, knowing that if you find a story, if it's true and if it's in the public interest, you will get it out there. That's kind of a heck of a thing to know.
I wanted to ask you as well about The Guardian's evolution from being a British newspaper to being something else now. It bills itself as a global news agency. Can you tell us about sort of what that means and what sort of challenges that poses?
So the Guardian, it's quite funny, sort of in print, it's a pretty small newspaper. We sell about 180, 190,000 copies a day, which doesn't make us even in the top 5 biggest papers in the UK, let alone in the world. But globally, we are now the 2nd biggest English language news site in the world. Only the Mail Online is bigger than us, and we are slightly bigger than the New York Times now. And that kind of means we're not talking to this small English audience anymore. About 1/3 of our audience is from the UK, just under 1/3 is from the US, and 1/3 is from the rest of the world. And so we're trying to work out what to do with that, and kind of how we treat the US as another home market, how we treat Australia as another home market. We're one of the biggest outlets there. And so we're doing things like, instead of having one foreign news desk in the in the UK, we have our foreign correspondents sort of checking into whichever the nearest sort of staffed office is. So they can file in their own time zones, and that means we can have a 24-hour news operation. We can hopefully come to the point where we can write domestic news in the US for a US audience. So we can try and sort of build really good international coverage for everyone, but in a lot of countries also be kind of a home coverage place too. And so it's really interesting trying to reshape from being a small newspaper to trying to work out, how do we do really important global journalism, and what does that newsroom look like? Who does it have in it? Even where do people sit? Where should your developers be? Where should your social people be? If something happens at 3 p.m. in the US and 8 p.m. in the UK, are we thinking about the front page of the UK paper? Are we thinking about the US website? Which audience is more important? These are kind of really interesting questions, and it kind of feels like, hopefully, we're one of the organisations in the lead of working out how you answer those and how you do the best work.
I wanted to ask you as well about sort of, as The Guardian evolves towards having an international readership base, to which public do its loyalties lie, to the extent that people in different countries sometimes have different interests in a particular story, and that if you have information that may be detrimental to a public in the United States, it may actually be helpful to people somewhere else in the world?
I always find this quite an interesting question, because you could very easily have argued, if you look at the sort of Abu Ghraib story, the US soldiers torturing Iraqi prisoners, that was broken by US media outlets. And were they acting against the US public's interest? A lot of people said, hey, reporting this, it puts our troops in more danger, it's not going to help our efforts. But I think it was absolutely in the US public's interest to know what was happening there and to know what was being done in their names. And I think that's kind of the interest we have to serve. If, there is no purpose for going into sort of information for its own sake, but I think you can serve
Well, in a case like that, it's quite clear
public
that it's
interest.
in the U.S. public's interest, I think, to know that their troops are acting wrongfully. What's less clear is, say, that the U.S. is tapping the phone of the German Prime Minister. That may actually be in the interest of the U.S. public to know what the German Prime Minister is thinking, but it's not in the interest of the German public.
It's certainly not in the interest of the German public, but it's also, you know, I think American citizens, just like Britons, just like everyone else, are told, hey, our governments are the good guys. These other guys, they're dodgy, but we only spy on terrorists. We only do this. You know, this is billions of dollars of your money. It's how your government sells itself to the world. And if you're being told, oh, well, you know, China, they do lots of bad spying, but we only do good spying, I think you can kind of say when the US is tapping the phones of its allies, it's not a good thing. I mean, it's not going to help people believe you. And if people don't trust Western media and the US media to say inconvenient truths, they're not really going to trust us to say anything. And so, you know, I hope it doesn't come down to these sort of sectional interests of what helps the US foreign policy today. It's what helps it in the long term. And actually, you know, Germany is now a close ally of the US. The UK and the US are certainly close allies. And those relationships are not going to be helped if you can sort of weaken them and betray them and spy on them in the background, because these things only escalate over time. You know, you're not going to tap Angela Merkel's phone and then go, oh, well, you know, she's not found out about that. I suppose we'll scale that back. You're going to do more and more and more and more until you get caught. And so helping pull these things hopefully quite early, I think ultimately serves all our interest.
And with just about a minute to go, I want to ask you as well about the differing legal climates in the U.S. and the United Kingdom. I know that you have lived in New York for some time, and that part of the reason that you moved from the U.K. to New York was to get some legal protections here. Now you're moving back to the U.K. Can you tell us about that?
So I've really got to recommend the First Amendment. I mean, you guys should not change that. We couldn't have done the Snowden story, whether the NSA side of it or the GCHQ side of it, without being a US and a UK operation. We had to shut down our reporting from the UK, and the fact that we had a US office and US media partners meant that didn't stop us at all. We could keep going, we could keep publishing, and so that ability to sort of globalize free speech is actually really helping us, and I hope will help sort of journalism full stop.
James Ball, thank you for joining us. That's all for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute and the Missouri School of Journalism. Our executive producer this week is Casey Morell. Tatiana Dare is our lead producer, with assistance from Batul Hassan, Anna Kowalska, and Bida Igbali. Travis McMillan from RJI is our technical director. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for tuning in, and please do join us next time.